One of America's earliest encounters with the Japanese took place during the Battle of Wake Island. A small but determined group of American Marine aviators valiantly defended the island until the very end. Their performance was exemplary, and their efforts were noted by the Marine Corps. Major Paul A. Putnam, the commander of VMF-211, played a crucial role in this historic battle. On November 28, 1941, Major Paul A. Putnam, along with his squadron, VMF-211, embarked for Wake Island aboard the USS Enterprise, CV-6. Putnam and his fellow Marines were preparing to pilot their Grumman F4F-3 Wildcats to support this vital outpost located approximately 2,000 miles west of their base at Pearl Harbor. Paul Albert Putnam was born on June 16, 1903, in Milan, Michigan. After relocating to Washington, Iowa, in 1909 he completed his high school education and later majored in civil engineering at Iowa State University. Despite a promising academic path, Putnam chose to enlist in the Marine Corps on December 1, 1923. Over the following years he served in various positions, including occupation duty in Nicaragua to assist in quelling a Marxist uprising. By March 3, 1926, Putnam had completed officer training and was commissioned as a second lieutenant. He returned to Nicaragua in early 1927, where he served in the 23rd Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Regiment, 2nd Marine Brigade. After gaining valuable experience, he returned to the U.S. in June 1928 and applied for flight training, earning his wings on May 7, 1929. He continued to conduct bombing and strafing operations in Nicaragua until 1938. Promoted to major in 1940, Putnam and VMF-211 were reassigned to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and on July 1, 1941, the squadron was renumbered VMF-211. They were equipped with modern Grumman F4F-3 Wildcats, replacing their older F-3 F-2 aircraft. Unfortunately, by the time they were ready to depart for Wake Island in November 1941, they hadn't had enough time to become fully familiar with their new aircraft. On November 17, 1941, Major Putnam took command of VMF-211. His squadron's move to Wake Island was expedited after the deterioration of U.S.-Japanese relations. Wake Island consisted of three main sections: Wake proper, Wilkes Island, and Petal Island. Before the arrival of the 1st Marine Defense Battalion in August 1941, Pan American Airways frequently visited Wake and operated a hotel complex on Petal Island, turning the island into a popular destination. On the morning of November 28, Major Putnam and his squadron departed for Pearl Harbor and arrived at Naval Air Station Ford Island. Initially, they were under the impression that they were on a routine overnight training mission. However, upon arriving aboard the USS Enterprise, they learned of their new orders. Wake Island was now their primary target, and the Enterprise was operating in a war zone. Putnam was advised by Vice Admiral William F. Halsey to proceed as needed upon arrival at Wake. Once at Wake Island, Putnam and his pilots faced numerous challenges. The Wildcat fighters were parked in an open lot with no protective revetments, surrounded by uneven coral fragments. Efforts were made to distribute the planes across the area to minimize damage, and a hardstand mat, the only safe parking spot, was no larger than 300 by 800 feet. Fueling was also problematic as the ground crews were inexperienced with the new aircraft, and additional labor was needed to build protective structures. On December 5, Putnam requested immediate construction of bunkers and other protective measures for the aircraft. His frustration with the slow progress was evident in his reports. Despite the challenges, the Marine aviators of VMF-211 continued to train and prepare for combat. They were directed to conduct patrols with 4 aircraft, as the garrison lacked a radar system and was hampered by the noise from the waves, making it difficult to detect incoming aircraft. The patrols conducted by VMF-211 were critical during the early days of the conflict. The first patrol on December 5 aimed to establish air-to-ground communications and give the pilots additional experience with their Wildcats. Second Lieutenant John F. Kenney, one of Putnam's pilots, developed a homing beacon to receive messages from the VMF-211 ground radio. On Sunday, December 7, Major Putnam granted the Marine Corps personnel of the 1st Marine Defense Battalion and VMF-211 a day off. The dawn patrol was set for December 8, and later that day, the Marine pilots were scheduled to fire the 50 caliber machine guns mounted on their Wildcats for the first time. By early afternoon, the completion of protective works was expected, and Putnam's frustration with the CP&B workers was mounting. That morning, Wake Island's U.S. Army radio truck received a frantic message from Hickam Field, Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor is under attack. This is no drill. The United States was thrust into war with Japan following the surprise attack on military installations across Oahu. By the time VMF 211 received the alert, Major Putnam was already airborne on a patrol. Major Devs had ordered general quarters for his Marines to man their positions across the atoll. Upon learning of the Japanese attack, Putnam placed VMF 211 on wartime status and returned to lead a follow-up patrol. His executive officer, Captain Henry Elrod, took over the lunchtime patrol, just over 700 miles south of Wake, at Roy Atoll in the Marshall Islands. The Japanese Air Attack Force No. 1, part of the 24th Air Flotilla Chose Air Group, was preparing its assault. A flight of 27 Mitsubishi G3M2 Type 96 bombers, codenamed Nell, armed with incendiary and fragmentation bombs, was en route to Wake. The Marines initially underestimated the capabilities of the G3M2 Nell bombers and were unfamiliar with their appearance. Commander Cunningham mentioned the Philippine Clipper, which had departed from Wake's lagoon for Guam before news of the Pearl Harbor attack arrived. Following the Clipper's landing, Putnam arranged for a reconnaissance mission with Captain John Hamilton, who was to take 2 Wildcats into the air to scout for any Japanese threats. 4 Wildcats were airborne at 12,000 feet over Wake, while the other 8 were dispersed on the ground. The VMF 211 and the 1st Defense Battalion Marines were still working to strengthen their positions. At 11:58 a.m., the formation of Nells approached the southern border of Wake Island, targeting the airfield. The 27 G3M2 bombers descended through low clouds, catching Wake's lookouts off guard. The Marines barely had time to take cover before Japanese bombs and machine gun fire rained down on the airfield. At the time of the attack, Putnam's ground crew was busy resupplying the Wildcats with bombs, gasoline, and ammunition. When the air raid alarm sounded, 1st Lieutenant George A. Graves and 2nd Lieutenant Robert A. Condor were in the flight tent preparing for the reconnaissance mission. Graves was killed instantly by a direct bomb hit as he entered his cockpit, and Condor was severely injured by shrapnel while trying to seek cover. 2nd Lieutenant Frank J. Holden was also killed in the raid, and Staff Sergeant Robert O. Arthur and Captain Frank C. Theron sustained minor injuries. 2nd Lieutenant Henry G. Webb was severely injured, and Major Putnam himself was shot in the left shoulder. The Marine barracks at Camp 1, Camp 2 on Wake's northern tip, and the Pan American Hotel complex on Peel Island were all targeted. The Philippine Clipper escaped unscathed despite being targeted for strafing. Major Walter L. G. Baylor and Commander Cunningham were among the first to find Major Putnam, who was severely injured and disoriented near the runway. After the Nells completed their attack and departed for Rota, Putnam quickly reorganized his squadron and began assisting with the evacuation of the dead and injured. Major Baylor described Putnam as a resilient and resourceful commander who had transformed remarkably after the first attack on Wake. VMF 211 suffered over 60% casualties from the attack, with 23 killed and 11 injured. Lieutenant Condor died in the hospital later that evening, increasing the number of pilot fatalities to 3. The squadron also lost crucial ground crew and equipment. Many Wildcats were severely damaged or destroyed, and essential supplies, including fuel tanks, spare parts, tools, and operational paperwork, were lost. Despite the heavy losses, Putnam's squadron continued to hold its ground. On December 9, the Japanese launched another raid with 27 Nells attacking at 13,000 feet. Marine casualties were minimal compared to the 55 civilian employees who perished. Major Des gunners shot down one of the attackers, while 2 of Putnam's pilots, 2nd Lieutenant David D. Clear and Tech Sergeant William J. Hamilton, contributed to the defense. On December 10, Japanese bombers returned for a 3rd consecutive raid. Captain Henry Elrod, known as Hammering Hank, intercepted the formation while already in the air and successfully shot down 2 Nells. VMF 211's resilience and effectiveness in defending Wake Island raised spirits both on the atoll and in the United States. On December 11, Major Dev's lookouts spotted a Japanese amphibious invasion force comprising 3 light cruisers, 6 destroyers, 2 transports, and patrol boats. Rear Admiral Satomichi Kajioka led the Wake invasion force, signaling a new phase in the battle for Wake Island. As the Japanese invasion fleet sailed from Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands, Major Deke instructed his gunners to hold fire until further notice. Wake Island was only 4,500 yards from the cruiser Yubari, Admiral Kajioka's flagship. When Deke gave the order, the 5-inch gun crews of the 1st Marine Defense Battalion fired, hitting several of Kajioka's ships, including the destroyer Hot, which was destroyed by a direct hit from Battery L on Wilkes Island, killing all 167 sailors aboard. Major Deke received confirmation from Putnam, Rod, and Thurin that no Japanese aircraft carriers were in the vicinity. With this information, Putnam and his pilots began bombing the Japanese ships, which were withdrawing from Wake. The Wildcats strafed the decks with .50 caliber machine gun fire, despite intense anti-aircraft fire from the cruisers, destroyers, and transports. Rod launched a devastating attack on the destroyer Karaji while Putnam, Thurin, and Fur targeted the light cruisers. Putnam hit a retreating warship with a bomb, but his Wildcat was damaged by enemy fire, causing him to crash land on Wake. The Kizuraji was sinking when Putnam and 2nd Lieutenant Kenny arrived. Elred's bomb caused further damage, resulting in an explosion that killed every sailor on board. With only 2 Wildcats left, Putnam set them up for the midday patrol, led by Lieutenants Kenny and Carl Davidson. They had to wait for the arrival of 17 G3M2S. Davidson shot down 2 Nells, while Kenny possibly downed 1. Despite the losses, the sinking of the Kizuraji and the downing of 2 to 3 bombers made December 11 a significant day for Putnam and his troops. However, the situation was dire. The 6th airstrike targeted the atoll early the following day with 2 Kuwait-ish H-6K-4 Mavis flying boats from the Yokohama Air Group, stationed in Majuro. One of the raiders was shot down by Captain Theron, who was already airborne for dawn patrol. Lieutenant Clear sank a Japanese submarine off the atoll, adding another victory for VMF 211. On December 12 and 13, with no sign of the Cheetos Air Group, Putnam took the opportunity to move his command post to a more secure location on the eastern edge of the burned-out parking lot. Many CPA civilian employees were hesitant to work near the airstrip, causing further frustration for Putnam, who had ongoing issues with CPA employees and their superintendent, Dan Turs. He reported slow and confusing progress on the construction work and lamented the consistent rejection of his efforts to compel civilian laborers to stay. On December 14, Kawanishi flying boats bombed the atoll but caused no damage. This marked the start of another early morning operation by the Yokohama Air Group. 30 Nells attacked Wake at midday while Kenny Hamilton and aviation machinist mate First Class James Hessen worked to restore a 3rd Wildcat to operational status. Despite a Wildcat being hit by a bomb within a revetment, Kenny and his team used a homemade crane to salvage the engine from the burning aircraft. Putnam considered their efforts the most outstanding of the entire campaign. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel launched a rescue operation from Pearl Harbor, sending Task Force 14 led by Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. This force included planes from the carrier USS Saratoga CV-3 and the seaplane tender USS Tangier, carrying supplies, troops from the 4th Defense Battalion, and additional Marines. Task Force 11 departed Pearl Harbor on December 15 to divert Japanese attention from the Saratoga and Tangier. Vice Admiral William S. Pye, who succeeded Kimmel after his dismissal on December 17, would soon decide the fate of Wake's rescue efforts. On December 15, despite having only 1 functioning Wildcat, Putnam and his squadron faced a night attack by Mavis flying boats, which caused minimal damage. The next day, 32 Nells bombed Wake, with the 1st Defense Battalion gunners claiming 1 shot down and damaging 4 or 5 more significantly. On December 17, the Japanese launched another attack with 27 Nells from a height of 18,000 feet, followed by another raid from the Yokohama Air Group later that afternoon, targeting Peel Island and Camp 1 with little effect. The Cheetos Air Group continued its assault on December 18 but did not target Wake on December 20. That afternoon, a single American Catalina arrived in Wake's lagoon with news of the relief force en route from Pearl Harbor. The next day, the Catalina was scheduled to depart for Midway with Major Baylor, who was to establish contact there. Putnam gave Baylor his operational report and a 2-page letter to his wife, Virginia, expressing the hardships of war and the resilience of his squadron. At 7 a.m. on December 21, the Catalina carrying Valor took off from Midway. Less than 2 hours later, Japanese aircraft carriers launched an attack on Wake with 18 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters. As the aircraft approached, Putnam, near Camp 2, rushed to the airfield. Despite constant harassment from Japanese planes, he managed to board Wildcat No. 9 and attempted to intercept the attackers. Though unsuccessful, Putnam was later awarded the Navy Cross for his bravery. Following the initial attack, Japanese naval planes from the carriers Hiryu and Soryu bombed Wake. The same day, 27 Nels carried out another raid. On December 22, Captain Furr and Second Lieutenant Davidson intercepted a formation of carrier aircraft. Furr shot down 2 Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers but was injured by debris from an exploded bomber. Davidson, last seen with a 0 on his tail, did not return. With only 2 Wildcats remaining, Putnam and his squadron were integrated as infantry under Major Deuce on the night of December 23. They were assigned to guard a 3-inch anti-aircraft gun, operated by Second Lieutenant Robert M. Hanna. As Japanese patrol boats landed troops on Wake's southern shoreline, intense fighting ensued. Despite the defenders' efforts, including Captain Elred and Major Putnam constructing a defensive line and intense fire from Hanna's gun, Japanese forces overwhelmed the position. When he tried to launch a grenade, an SNFL rifleman shot and killed him. For his fellow Marines and the CP Navy staff, Hammering Hank was a favorite, and his passing was deeply mourned. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his valor during the siege. Major Putnam was also injured by a Japanese bullet to the face and neck, but he continued fighting despite significant blood loss and intermittent loss of consciousness. Due to inclement weather, the Wake Relief Force was delayed and was still 500 miles to the east. Admiral Pai, aware of the proximity of Japanese carriers, was disheartened and concluded that rescuing Wake was unfeasible. He decided to recall the relief force, including Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who had ordered the return to Pearl Harbor. Left to fend for themselves, Putnam and the remaining Wake Islanders faced relentless bombardment. After over 6 hours of continuous fighting, Admiral Kajioka returned with more ships than in the initial landing attempt. By 8 a.m., the silhouettes of Japanese ships were visible on the horizon. Commander Cunningham made the painful decision to surrender to avoid further American casualties, as over 1,000 Japanese SNFL troops had already landed on Wake. A white surrender flag was created, and Major Duke, along with his assistant, Sergeant Donald R. Malik, were led around the atoll by the Japanese. Upon reaching Hanna's gun position, Putnam, heavily bleeding from a facial injury, emerged from hiding. Duke noted that Putnam looked like hell itself, his face a red smear. After surrendering, Duke and his group crossed the atoll to deliver the surrender news. By late morning on December 23, all resistance had ceased. The Japanese began interrogating the prisoners, with Putnam, Thurin, and Lieutenants Kenny and Clear singled out for execution due to the heavy losses inflicted on the Japanese during the siege. Virginia Putnam received the first of several letters from USNC headquarters in Washington, D.C., on January 9, 1942, revealing that her husband was likely a prisoner of war. Putnam's letter to her wouldn't arrive until October 1942, in which he expressed how much her letters uplifted him and how the world seemed lighter knowing his family was well. The approximately 1,600 military and civilian survivors were gathered by the Japanese and taken to the airstrip, where they were questioned by Japanese intelligence officers. Despite their interest in Putnam due to his aviation and communications expertise, he refused to speak. On January 11, the Wake defenders were informed they would be evacuated on the Japanese liner Nidamaru the next day. When Putnam and around 30 of Wake's officers boarded the Nidamaru, they were confined to a small area and had their valuables seized. Brutal beatings followed as they were forced into the ship's hold. On January 12, 1942, the Nidamaru sailed from Wake, taking with it those needed for upcoming construction projects and those too ill or injured to be evacuated. Tragically, 98 workers were killed by their captors on Wake. By October 7, 1943, the Nidamaru arrived in Yokohama on January 18 after 6 stressful days at sea. Putnam was among the 20 removed from the ship for additional questioning. He spent much of his captivity at the Zentsuji prisoner of war camp, where he kept a detailed journal from January 9 onward. documenting his experiences. Zensuji, which opened shortly before Putnam's arrival, was a show camp intended to highlight Japan's humane treatment of Allied captives. Putnam was later transferred to the Roenemer Island detention camp on June 23, 1945, after being evacuated from Zensuji, following the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6 and 9, 1945. American supplies reached Roenemer in September. Paul Putnam returned home in a haggard state after nearly 4 years of imprisonment. Despite his hardships, Putnam remained devoted to his country and the Marines. He reported to the Marine Corps School at Quantico in March 1946 and later served as Deputy Chief of Staff for the 2nd Marine Aircraft Wing. He concluded his career as Commanding Officer of Marine Air Group 14. In October 1951, Putnam was attached to Fleet Marine Force Pacific at Marine Corps Air Station El Toro, California. He retired in 1956 with the rank of Brigadier General. Putnam's distinguished military career earned him numerous awards, including the Navy Cross, Air Medal with Gold Stars, Presidential Unit Citation, Marine Corps Expeditionary Medal with WW2, Purple Heart with Star and Cluster, World War II Victory Medal, Prisoner of War Medal, and the 2nd Nicaraguan Campaign Medal. He spent his later years hunting, golfing, and fishing with his wife and 3 daughters. Paul Albert Putnam passed away on May 21, 1982, in Mesa, Arizona. He left behind a legacy of selflessness and sacrifice. His wife Virginia described him as the most pleasant and sensible person she had ever met. His humility meant that others often spoke of his adventures before he did. Currently under the control of the Pacific Air Force's Regional Support Center, PCAF, of the 11th Air Force, Wake Island is off-limits to civilians. The Wake Island Museum, located inside the airport terminal building, houses artifacts and antiques related to the atoll's history. A prominent wooden plaque bearing the Wake Island Avengers emblem and a framed photo of Paul Putnam honor his bravery and leadership.